Peaksbury was the name. His game was disaster. Willa needn't have bothered with cleaning up, because the expert never went inside. He got out of his white pickup truck wearing clean pressed khakis and a button-down shirt, and required less than an hour to wreck her world. His tools were a clipboard, retractable tape measure, and a little trowel he used for scraping the edges of bricks, looking for identifying marks. Masonry happened to be his area of special interest. He followed his nose to a date in very short order, 1880. He declared the house to have been built that year or soon after. No, Willa said, we're sure it's older than that. Peaksbury looked from Willa to Chris and back to Willa. He was too young and polite to say what he was thinking, but Willa saw it plainly. Did I just drive an hour to talk to a couple of know-it-all shitwits? I'm sorry, she said. It's just that we have conflicting information. Why that exact date? In 1683, the General Assembly fixed a common size for common brick that conformed to the English-made product of the time. There wasn't a brick in New Jersey bigger or smaller than 9.5 but by 4.5 by 3 until 1880, when the Dunwitty brickyard opened over by Union Lake. Wow, Willa thought. She did ask. He took a pen out of his shirt pocket, looked at it, put it back, and soldiered on. So Dunwitty struck mud over by that lake and invested in machinery nobody else could afford at the time. He'd already made one fortune in glass factories. His new yard made bricks cheaper and faster than any other in this part of the country, and they turned out like a little smaller. Nobody called him on it, because he paid off the authorities. So these are some kind of mafia bricks? Willa asked. He's quite a big name in bricks. Orville Dunwitty, he said, dodging any hint of irony. Later on, his son Leverett took over the operation. The bricks themselves are worth something to folks who really know their masonry. She had to wonder how many folks really knew their masonry. Peaksbury knelt at the base of a corner wall and scraped lightly at the end of a brick. Now you see this mark on the end, a little impression of a D. Willa and Chris leaned over obediently to observe the D. That's the Dunwitty stamp. Chris had not yet said a word to this expert, even when Willa had deferentially introduced him as our town historian, and the two men shook hands. She'd noticed he'd worn his best suit to this appointment, an antique white three-piece ensemble, a tad more eccentric even than his everyday wear. Christopher, she realized, was starstruck. I see the mark, Willa said. I'm not arguing with any of that. You obviously know bricks. But we've done a lot of research on a person who lived at this address. We're sure he lived here, and it was only for a short time between 1874 and 1875. There is no mistake about those dates. Chris finally chimed in with his trademark hauteur, to Willa's relief. That was a significant year in Vineland, 1875, as you undoubtedly know. Peaksbury looked blank, and not too interested. Charles Landis and Uri Carruth, the murder of the century. Chris was rallying now. Willa decided to step aside and let the eggheads duke it out. A resident of this house was involved in the famous trial. We have primary sources on that, newspaper articles, that level of reliability. Our person of interest was a public figure. We know it was this house, Willa added, seeing a potential weak spot. We even have a correspondence that mentions those two trees. The expert ran a hand through his tidy brown hair and looked around the yard as if for an escape route. Willa was starting to feel embarrassed for everyone present. I'm not saying the trees weren't there in 1875, he allowed. I'm not saying your man wasn't here. This house wasn't here. These bricks at that time were mud in the ground. The plant that manufactured them did not make a brick before 1880. Our dates and identification for our historical personage are solid, Chris said, getting peevish. We know it was not after 1880 because he left town in 1875. Prior to the fall of that year, and for most of the previous one, he was right here. So what do you suggest he was living in, a tent? Peaksbury looked at the house a little sadly. For such a long time, Willa began to feel uncomfortable. The cockeyed chimneys, those horrible cracked walls, the man might as well have been looking up her skirt. Finally, he spoke. No, I expect he lived in a house, something that got pulled down to make way for this one. Oh, she said. This one. This would have been prime real estate at the time. If the house wasn't up to snuff, the owner wouldn't have hesitated to raise and rebuild in order to stay here in the center of town. But he didn't stay here. Chris parried, failing to move on to the next step of the logical progression as Willa had. She'd relaxed her denial muscles and heard what the man was saying. Thatcher Greenwood lived in a house that got torn down. For whatever reason, soon after he left Vineland, the walls came down. His castle hadn't stood. You've still got a late 19th century structure, the man offered, clearly seeing the need here for a consolation prize. Not that addition, of course. That's 1920s. And I can't vouch that the rest of the structure is worth the expense of restoration. To be honest, I'm going to vouch that it isn't. From what I can see standing here, unless you've got some extenuating value, but 1880s is still historic. That's the nail on the head, Willa told him. We've been betting on the extenuating value clause, structure associated with persons of historic significance. She waited for the thunder and lightning, or worse, to burst into tears in front of these men, but they were paying no attention to Willa now, circling each other in the ring. There was no win here. The house hadn't stood. She put her faith in a resident who probably had been just as stuck then as she was now, had inherited some inappropriate wreck of a place and tried everything to keep it standing. He'd failed, and so would she. She thanked the expert, took his card, and sent him away in his white truck. Chris seemed to want to hang around for a debriefing, but Willa couldn't bear it. She pretended she had things to do inside, a baby to check on. She kept waiting for tears, but what came to her instead was a weird, deathly calm. Beyond the mess of everyone's wants and needs lay a simpler calculus of what this house could be and what it couldn't. She'd asked for a fact-finding mission, and that's what she got. Even if the facts blew up everything she'd counted on, nothing is free. They went to the graveyard by day. Tig pushed Dusty in a lightweight fold-up stroller she'd gotten in trade when she decided to get rid of the Cadillac buggy. And Nick, of course, fit handedly in Willa's pocket. This family was learning to travel light. After some reconnaissance, they'd realized their illegal interment would be less risky in broad daylight than at midnight. Almost no one ever came into the cemetery, but cars passed steadily on Park Avenue and North Valley, and nocturnal shenanigans would likely attract more notice from people driving by. To normalize the appearance of their mission, they brought a picnic, which they laid out on a blanket in the appointed spot. It had been Willa's idea to get a bottle of ouzo, which neither of them had ever tasted and wasn't all that easy to find. They toyed with the idea of bringing shot glasses to throw down and shatter after the toast, Zorba style, but decided against it, this being not yet the afterlife. Someone would have to pick up the pieces. His self-confidence was Herculean. Willa said, lifting her juice glass and knocking it back, ouzo was alchemical. Clear as water in the bottle, but when poured into a glass with water, it instantly turned whitish, like an ammonia-based cleaning fluid that pretty well defined the taste also. Though Tig had the better palate, she got cleaning fluid with notes of licorice. To self-confidence, Tig said, knocking back her shot, wincing. They sat cross-legged on a plaid blanket, staring at the baby food jars of ashes that sat between them. Dusty also could sit unassisted now, making it a foursome. So was his vocabulary, Herculean. Willa said, raising an empty glass, but I think I'm done with the fucking ouzo. Me too, Tig agreed, setting down her cup. Here's to Papu's vocabulary and fuck the Virgin Mary. To the Hor Ocean. Puse gamun te pasaria, I think. Gamoto. Willa glanced at Dusty. He'd recently learned to manage a bottle himself and was doing that now, while watching them both with wide eyes over the plugged-in dome. I'm sorry he'll never know Nick. But can you imagine sending him to preschool with that kind of language rattling around in his head? Mom, you were almost as bad. We never told you, but Zeke had to go to the principal in 4th grade for telling the lunch lady no thanks. He didn't want any fucking green beans. Zeke did? He swears to this day he didn't know it was a bad word. He'd heard it from you and Dad so much he just thought it was a regular adjective. Willa, without a defense, picked up her tomato and cheese sandwich and finished it off. They'd stuffed a generous picnic into the mesh pocket on the back of the new little stroller, which weighed ounces instead of pounds, easily lifted with one hand. It felt like the end of an era. Being done with that ostentatious stroller, in the same trading session, Tig had ditched the Gucci diaper bag and all other baby items that were more showy than functional. The car seat that they'd retained, but not the baby monitors with TV cameras, other mobiles with literal bells and whistles. In the exchange, along with a good deal of cash, Tig produced a wardrobe of lightly used clothes, as Dusty's had suddenly outgrown every stitch he owned. Also a bale of clothes diapers, because Tig was sick of throwing shit away. Willa thought she would sweep the motherhood medals if she stuck that one out. But something told her this wasn't just a show of sincerity to impress Willa. The process had a life of its own, and at this stage of her non-pregnancy, Tig was nesting in her anti-material way, preparing for a baby on her own terms. And really, after everything she'd done for Nick, how bad was baby shit? Dusty emptied his bottle, threw it down, and lifted his arms to be picked up. Tig swooped up the boy and lifted him in the air, making him shriek ecstatically. He worked his arms and legs like an earnest little swimmer mastering the air. Tig cooed nonsense as she lowered his face toward hers, touching his button nose to her own. He reached for the handles of her hair and she swooshed him upward again, both of them squealing. Willa remembered the days in a grief-drenched Boston apartment where she'd first watched her son with his son, waiting for the chemical magic that would rivet them together for life, waiting for this. Willa lay on her back and looked up at the sky through tree branches that glowed with a faint green haze of leafiness soon to come. It reminded her of the heartbreaking, awkward furs on a 13-year-old boy, the end of something that everyone agrees must end. She had no earthly idea where she was going to live now, what would become of her family. The only one with an assured destination was Nick. After a while, Tig put Dusty down on the blanket, got out the hand and trowel that they brought, and carefully lifted a divot of grass. She pushed the baby food jar into the slot, exactly as if she were planting a large seed. Willa started to help replace the sod, but Tig stopped her. "Hang on." She reached into the back pocket of her jeans. "I told him this would go with him. You've seen it, right?" She handed over a small slip of photo. And not exactly square, it had been cut down from a larger size, maybe to remove other people or to make it fit in a tiny frame. It was creased, had been bent, extremely worn. Where did this come from? He used to keep it in his cigarette lighter. Remember that gold one he had with the little sliding compartment on the side? "Oh yeah, I do." After we made him quit smoking, he kept it in different places, like where? Tig shrugged. "The drawer in his nightstand and a wallet he never used. When we arranged everything to bring in the hospital bed, he kind of freaked. He kept asking me to hide it someplace or another. Finally, I struck it in with his morphine stuff, the pill crusher and all. He liked it being in there. I figured you would have seen it." All of this astonished Willa, that he'd had such presence of mind at that late stage and managed to maintain an arena of privacy, mostly that she'd missed it altogether. The photo was a black and white portrait with a yellow-brown cast of antique chemicals, losing ground against time, taken in Greece. She could tell by the whitewashed stone wall behind the couple. Who but the Greeks pursued that obsession with whitewash? The background was a haze of yellowish clouds, but the subjects were clear enough. A tall man with an arm around his tiny bride, gripping her as if gale-force winds were expected, but smiling, both of them. Her head was enlarged by a hat or a headscarf or a crown. If this was a wedding portrait, Willa realized that's what it would be. The Stefana made of leaves and flowers. She and Iona had worn these in the only trace of orthodoxy they'd allowed into their wedding. In the old days, the couple wore them for a week, but if Nick wore any headgear into this photo, it was drowned under the mane of black curls. Willa held the photo as close as her eyes could focus. The little bride in the vice grip of her man looked fiercely happy, small but undominated. She looked like Tig, and the young man, so exquisitely undamaged, tall, dark, and handsome. She handed the photo back to Tig with salt burning her eyes. Tig stared at her. "Mom, are you sad about Papu? The words caught. When Nick died, she'd called the proper authorities and watched the body roll out of the house on a gurney without feeling much of anything. On Wednesday, when the architecture expert took the wrecking ball to her future, no tears arrived. Nothing got to Willa anymore. She shook her head to clear this away. He looked just like Iano. She said finally, "I never knew that. I wish I had." Seriously, You didn't see how much they looked alike. Not at all. Willa had a disorienting recollection of Tig making a face at the goth girl in reference to Iano's putative attractiveness. And whack, if she remembered correctly, her beautiful Iano just another old guy. Tig kneaded grass and sawed back in place over the burial, leaving no visible trace, and quietly began packing up their picnic. She'd kindly offered no judgment on Willa for failing to see the resemblance, absolving the evergreen human crime of denying the past and seeing oneself as original. Willa looked around at an April day struck through with clear light. It felt like more than she deserved. As long as we're here, I'd like to look for somebody. A grave. Who, Mary Treat? Willa was startled. You knew she's buried here. I know where she is. With Dusty back in the stroller, they bumped over the grass to the paved road that snaked through the grounds. Outside the cemetery's tall iron fence, the traffic steadily passed, but in here, the grounds were all theirs. They followed the road into the oldest section where gravestones took more liberties, obelisks, corbels, orgies, a few unapologetic phalluses, statues of angels. Many names were all but erased from the stones, rain-washed faces. Tig led the way, going off-road again to enter a section of smaller markers, and suddenly there was Mary. Goodness. Willa sat down beside the marker. It was as modest as the woman herself. Not even a headstone exactly, just a small stone column about knee-high and equally wide with a slanted top engraved with the name and dates. Mary A. Treat, 1830 to 1923. The weathered granite was discreetly mottled with areolas of yellow and green lichens, channeling the soul of a woman who loved ferns and mosses. Willa laid her face against the stone, after months of cat and mouse, thinking she'd nearly touched Mary before losing her again. This was as close as she was going to get. Is that what you call a plinth? Tig asked. She, standing by, and Dusty in a stroller had their heads tilted in a similar quizzical aspect that made Willa laugh aloud. What? Tig asked, startled. Is that a dumb question? No, not at all. Technically, this style is called a pulpit. What's dumb is that I actually know that. She knew because decades ago, in her more commercial days, she'd done a brochure for a monument company, and her brain seemed resistant to the life-changing art of pitching things out. Willa had written hundreds of articles about thousands of things and probably could still list most of them. None had laid any lasting claim on her heart. She pressed both hands against the school stone, feeling the roughness of the lichens. Mary had lived her discipline. Both of them had. She and Thatcher, with an integrity that led them to give up, practically speaking, their lives. Born under the moon of paradigm shift, they got to be present to a world turning over on itself. Willa ached for devotion like that, something to move her beyond herself, out from under the soggy cardboard box she might be holding over her head. A visual Tig had lodged in her mind that Willa would pay good money to erase. Over here is another treat. Tig said, I think it's treat. You can make out almost, and it sort of matches. Husband? Willa got up to look. Husband, sort of. Now here was a conspicuously uneasy his and hers setting. The matching monument was set much more than an arm's length away, more like the proverbial 10-foot pole. And it really didn't match. It was slightly bigger, all square angles, no lichens, and a flat top that took the full brunt of eroding rains. The J Treat was almost gone. No date had been engraved. Willa knew Joseph had died just a few years after running off to New York in pursuit of free love and a bigger audience. Victoria Woodhull spurned him. He devoted a few last years to revenge shaming her and died without friends. Mary would have been obliged to buy this plot for the two of them. Probably she told her relatives, okay, but not too close. And then she outlived him by more than 40 years, while most people who knew her probably pitied her for lacking the protection of marriage. She lived adventurously and committed her voice to the page so well that Willa could hear it plainly. Tig sat on the ground a little distance away to admire Mary's real estate, with Dusty on her lap and an accommodating family stone for backrest. Willa joined them. Dusty was drifting after lunch and bottle came nap. How did you know where this grave was? I know people here. Tig grinned. Willa knew that she came here often. It made sense she would have noticed the name when she happened on it. For a beautiful 10 minutes or so they were quiet, with nothing required to complete the space between mother and daughter. Willa relaxed her focus and took in the view of all that even ground. The immense trees with their arms lifted, the motley garden of stones at their feet bearing an aspect of afterthought. Little flags posted here and there signaled flashes of patriotism that had flared and burned out. "I know you come here a lot," Willa finally said. "I guess I have wondered why." "It's comforting. All these dead people. It might not be a conventional position. I know, but I'm not superstitious. I just like seeing all these lives. Most of them started in this town and ended here. They're rooted. Yeah, literally. Most of the coffins have degraded, especially the older burials. Before people got all defensive about trying to keep their bodies out of the carbon cycle." Willa had to smile. Only her daughter would see embalming as defensive. "So you think we should have dumped Papu out of the jar to get him recycled?" Tig looked at her. "Would that be okay with you?" "Of course. If we can even find that spot again, we can liberate him." Tig was pleased. Pine box with a body inside, no preservatives. That's how most of these people went down. So now they're part of these trees. Isn't that where you want to end up, Mom? Isn't a tree like that? Willa looked at the oak over the heads. Its trunk was a monument to resilience and its branches to tenderness, touched at their tips with the faint rose color of baby oak leaves. Who would not want to end up in a tree like that? Plus, Tig said it reminds him to be patient, seeing all these people that have passed on. I get frustrated sometimes waiting for people to die. Yeah, to be honest, the guys in charge of everything right now are so old. They really are, Mom. Older than you. They figured out the meaning of life in, I guess, the 1950s and 60s, when it looked like there would always be plenty of everything, and they're applying to that to now. It's just so ridiculous. Willa could see the reason in this, unnerving as it might be. I get that your generation is waiting for their chance. I remember feeling that way too, but there's no guarantee, unfortunately. Like, poor them. She pointed at the family stone facing them. Frank and Emma, both born 1859, produced 4 children who all died in 1888, and so did Frank. Oh yeah, the Courigs. I've noticed them before. Willa imagined this Emma, whose husband and children, the youngest an infant. She tried desperately to nurse through some fever, then followed in a cart to the spot, buried them, and went home to her empty house, perhaps to be avoided by her neighbor as a typhoid pariah. Not much comfort there. Dusty was sleeping sideways across Tiggs's legs in a pose of spectacular relaxation. Had dropped back, mouth open. Willa thought of the days when he fought sleep as if death lurked inside it. Tig had one hand resting on his belly and seemed to be contemplating the tragedy of the Courigs. The thing is, Mom, the secret of happiness is low expectations. That's a good reminder right there. If you didn't lose your husband and kids all in 1 year, smile. You're ahead of the game. Wow, that's what I raised you to believe in? Low expectations? What did you want me to believe in? I don't know. You can be anything you want. Hitch your wagon to a star and all that jazz. Tig didn't smile. I saw you and Dad doing that, hitching your wagon to the 10-year star, and it didn't look that great to me. You made such a big deal about security that you sacrificed giving us any long-term community. I think there are other ways to put that, but not simpler. 3 words. Willa wanted to get up and walk away from this censorious child and parenthood altogether, the Mobius strip of torment. Their day had been nearly perfect. Naturally, it had to blow up. She stood up so quickly, her vision briefly washed out, brushed off her jeans, listened to her throbbing head. Walk away, walk away. She'd just been accused of vagrancy, it seemed, or a refusal to dig in. She dug in. And you think you can be a parent, she said, standing over her diminutive daughter with a baby on her lap. Looming, really, which felt aggressive. She sat down again. I guess your plan would be to live somewhere perfect and give Dusty roots. No place is perfect. Don't be so touchy. Well, it's been kind of a week, Tig. I just found out our house is slated for demolition. Mom, the permafrost is melting, millions of acres of it. Willa tried to see a connection, and I'm just worried about my house. That's your point? Tig shook her head. It's so scary. So scary. It's going to be fire and rain, Mom. Storms we can't deal with. So many people homeless. Not just homeless, but placeless. Cities go underwater, and then what? You can't shelter in place anymore when there isn't a place. Willa tucked her hands between her knees and declined to believe these things. The Middle East and North Africa are almost out of water. Asia's underwater. Syria is dystopian. Somalia, Bangladesh, dystopian. Everybody's getting weather. That never happened before. Melting permafrost means we've got like a minute to turn this mess around, or else it's going to stop us. Well, shit, Tig, and you want to raise a kid? I don't want to get pregnant. But he's already here. She stroked the cloudburst of his hair with a feathery touch. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, Mom. She said quietly, you and Dad did your best. But all the rules have changed, and it's hard to watch people keep carrying on just the same. It's like it's business as usual. All the rules, really. Tig nodded almost imperceptibly, like a seed head bobbing on its stem. She didn't look at Willa, but no out at the graves. People can change their minds about little things, but on the big ones, they'd rather die first. A used-up planet scares the piss out of them after they spent their whole lives thinking the cupboard would never go bare. No offense, Mom, but you're kind of not that different from Papu. You want a nice house, that's all your own. You want your kids to have more than you did. I'm human, Tig. We live, we consume. I think that's just how we have to be. Of course you think that. When everybody around you thinks the same way, you can't even see what you're believing in. Most of us can't see past our noses, but for some reason you can. Tig grinned. Just that special? Seriously, I'm asking. I don't know. I've got less of a stake. You and Dad kept turning your hamster wheel, and so did Zeke, but I never thought I had much of a shot, especially with Zeke telling me ever since I was born that I'm a pea-brain midget loser. It makes you kind of sober about your prospects. Willa's heart constricted at the thought of a daughter incurring damage while she looked the other way. Siblings teased. That was normal. Every mother secretly had a favorite, but Willa had been careful not to let that show. Tig always seemed impenetrable, even superior. One after another, these defenses rose to Willa's mind, and she understood this was how it worked, refusing to see past her nose. I always thought if I was good at anything, she finally said, it was being a mother. And what I hear you saying is that I've let you down completely. Tig considered this. Looking at the boy in her lap, a person can succeed and fail at the same time. Maybe letting me down was your way of getting me to be me. Fierce. Willa nodded. Not that she'd wish quite that on any child or the mother involved. I was going to say adaptable. You know what's funny? Sometimes the stuff you hate for yourself you admire in other people. Like Jorge. I love that he's a grown-up, and I know it's because he wasn't sheltered. He got zip in the dad department. I wondered about that.